Ted Bundy's story begins not in darkness, but in the light of ordinary charm. He was the neighbor you trusted, the classmate you admired, the man who seemed destined for something greater. But behind the smile and the intelligence was a shadow that grew quietly, unseen, until it consumed him, and everyone who crossed his path. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's life began with deception. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried and deeply religious. At a time when being an unwed mother carried heavy stigma, she fled to a home for single mothers to give birth in secret. When she returned to Philadelphia, her parents presented Ted as their own child, telling him that his mother was his sister. It was a small lie, meant to protect the family's reputation, but one that would fracture Ted's sense of identity for life. Bundy's early years were marked by emotional distance and a creeping sense of otherness. He grew up believing his grandparents were his parents, and his real mother was merely his sister. When he eventually learned the truth, the betrayal lodged itself deep in his psyche. It wasn't just a family secret. It was the first mask in a life defined by masks. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was a domineering man prone to violent outbursts. He beat family members and tortured animals, setting the tone for the household's tension. His grandmother was meek, submissive, and often retreated from conflict. For young Ted, control and chaos coexisted under one roof. He learned early that the world was unpredictable, and that power came from hiding emotion. When Louise eventually moved Ted to Tacoma, Washington, and married John Bundy, Ted took his stepfather's name. John was a kind but simple man who worked as a cook at a local hospital. Ted despised him. He wanted sophistication, ambition, and prestige, qualities his stepfather lacked. Even as a teenager, Bundy viewed himself as different, superior. But beneath the arrogance was a void, a hollow need for validation. In school, Bundy was intelligent, articulate, and socially detached. Teachers noticed his ability to mimic charm, to say exactly what people wanted to hear. But there was something off about him. He seemed to observe people more than he engaged with them, studying their behavior like a scientist taking notes. He learned how to mirror emotion, how to look kind without feeling kindness. Bundy's teenage years hinted at the behaviors to come. He developed voyeuristic habits, peering into windows at night, following women through the streets. He began stealing, not for necessity but for thrill, for the rush of control. Psychologists later described this as the embryonic stage of his criminal psychology. Dominance expressed through secrecy and risk. Despite his awkwardness, Bundy was determined to project normalcy. After graduating high school, he attended the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. Ironically, he excelled in the subject, analyzing others with empathy he didn't actually feel. This skill, understanding emotion intellectually but not emotionally, became his greatest weapon. In 1967, Bundy met a woman who would define his early life, Stephanie Brooks. She was beautiful, educated, and came from a wealthy family. To Bundy, she represented everything he wanted but couldn't have: status, control, approval. When she eventually broke up with him, calling him immature and aimless, he was devastated. The rejection struck at his deepest insecurity, that he was ordinary, unworthy. Years later, after reinventing himself as a confident, successful man, Bundy tracked her down. He seduced her again, rekindled the relationship, and then just as suddenly cut off all contact. He vanished without explanation. It was his revenge, his way of reversing the power dynamic. Psychologists later viewed this as a pivotal moment. Bundy had learned that domination could replace love. By the early 1970s, Bundy's outward life looked ideal. He worked for the Washington State Republican Party, volunteered on political campaigns, and enrolled in law school. He was charming, articulate, and well-connected. His colleagues described him as charismatic and capable. He even volunteered at a suicide hotline, where he saved lives with his calm, reassuring voice. Among those who worked with him was Anne Rule, who would later write The Stranger Beside Me, a haunting chronicle of Bundy's double life. But behind the mask of normalcy, Bundy's fantasies were deepening. He began stalking women, fixating on those who resembled Stephanie, long-haired brunettes with center parts. He followed them from libraries, coffee shops, and dormitories, studying their movements, rehearsing abductions in his mind. His fantasies were no longer about love. They were about possession. In January 1974, fantasy became reality. Linda Ann Healy, a University of Washington student, disappeared from her home in the early morning hours. Her bed was neatly made, her blood-soaked pillowcase folded beneath the covers. The scene was disturbingly organized, controlled. It was Bundy's signature before the world even knew his name. Over the following months, more women vanished across Washington and Oregon. Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, all young, educated, and full of promise. The disappearances baffled investigators. There was no forced entry, no pattern they could see, except that each woman vanished without a trace. Witnesses began reporting encounters with a charming man who introduced himself as Ted. He appeared injured, his arm in a sling or his leg in a cast, and asked for help carrying books or loading a sailboat. Once the victim agreed, she was never seen again. Bundy's ruse was elegant in its simplicity. He exploited empathy. The same quality that defines humanity became his tool for control. By summer 1974, fear gripped the Pacific Northwest. Women were warned not to walk alone, not to trust strangers, not to be kind. Then came the turning point. On July 14th, at Lake Sammamish State Park, 2 women disappeared in broad daylight. Witnesses described a man named Ted with a tan Volkswagen Beetle, wearing a sling and speaking politely. It was the first time the mask slipped. Police compiled a list of suspects named Ted who drove Beetles. One name stood out, Theodore Bundy, a law student and political aide. But Bundy didn't fit the profile of a killer. He was handsome, well-spoken, and educated. Even when acquaintances reported him to police, detectives dismissed the idea. Serial killers, they thought, were monsters, disheveled, deranged, visibly dangerous. Bundy was none of those things. Behind closed doors, however, his rituals grew darker. He returned to crime scenes, revisiting the remains of his victims. He photographed them, posed them, and preserved their images as trophies. For Bundy, murder wasn't an act of rage, it was an act of ownership. He didn't want to destroy his victims, he wanted to possess them forever. In late 1974, Bundy left Washington for Salt Lake City to attend law school. The killings followed. Women began vanishing from Utah, Colorado, and Idaho in an identical pattern. Bundy's compulsion had no geographic boundaries. He changed states, changed environments, but not his behavior. Each crime was rehearsed and refined. each victim chosen for resemblance, vulnerability, or opportunity. His self-control, however, began to erode. In November 1974, Bundy attempted to abduct a woman named Carol DaRonch from a shopping mall, posing as a police officer investigating a theft. She sensed something was wrong, but reluctantly entered his car. When he tried to handcuff her, she fought back and escaped. Her survival would later become one of the key pieces of evidence that brought him down. Around this time, Bundy began to unravel socially. He dropped out of law school, claiming disillusionment. But the truth was simpler. His double life was becoming harder to maintain. The divide between Ted the scholar and Ted the predator was shrinking. He returned frequently to the mountains of Washington, where he had hidden remains, sometimes days, sometimes weeks after the murders. In August 1975, Bundy's luck finally ran out. A Utah police officer noticed his Volkswagen circling a neighborhood late at night. When the officer pulled him over, he found a ski mask, crowbar, rope, and handcuffs. Bundy was arrested for possession of burglary tools, but detectives soon realized the significance of what they had found. When Carol DaRonch identified him in a lineup, the facade began to crack. Still, even in custody, Bundy was calm and confident. He believed he could talk his way out of anything. He studied the case files, analyzed the prosecution, and treated his trial like a chess game. He was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But he wasn't finished. In June 1977, while awaiting extradition to Colorado for a murder trial, Bundy escaped from the law library during a recess. He jumped from a second-story window and fled into the mountains. 8 days later, starving and exhausted, he was caught. But his obsession with control wouldn't let him stop there. 6 months later, he escaped again, this time from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs. He had sawed a hole in the ceiling, crawled through ducts, and walked out the front door disguised as a civilian. By the time authorities realized he was gone, Bundy was already hundreds of miles away. He stole a car, drove across the country, and eventually ended up in Florida. It was there, far from the Pacific Northwest, that his final and most violent chapter began. By the winter of 1978, Ted Bundy had shed the last pretense of control. He was a fugitive, surviving on charm, theft, and desperation. His once polished exterior had begun to fray, but his confidence remained. He'd escaped twice from custody, evaded capture across several states. And now he was in Florida, thousands of miles from where his name was whispered in fear. But the man who had lived by control was slipping into chaos. Bundy arrived in Tallahassee in early January under the alias Chris Hagen. He rented a small room near the Florida State University campus, blending once again into his surroundings with effortless deceit. He introduced himself to neighbors as polite and quiet, often smiling, occasionally borrowing tools, and always maintaining a sense of composure. Yet behind closed doors, the cracks were showing. His stolen credit cards were running out. He was living on the edge of exposure. The control that had defined his life was dissolving into recklessness. Then came January 15th, 1978, the night that would forever define his legacy. In the early hours, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened next lasted only minutes, but it was an explosion of violence so brutal that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. He entered through a back door, carrying a piece of oak firewood as a weapon. Moving silently from room to room, he attacked 4 women as they slept. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were bludgeoned and strangled to death. 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were left severely injured but survived. The attack was ferocious, disorganized, a stark contrast to the calculated precision of his earlier crimes. Bundy was unraveling. After leaving Chi Omega, Bundy broke into another house just a few blocks away, attacking Cheryl Thomas, a dance student, leaving her with a broken jaw and permanent hearing loss. For investigators, the pattern was unmistakable. This was no longer a man carefully orchestrating his crimes. It was a killer driven by compulsion, acting on impulse. The need for control had given way to chaos. For weeks, Bundy continued to drift, stealing cars, shoplifting, sleeping in motels, and using stolen identities. His final victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, abducted from her junior high school on February 9, 1978. The act was shocking even by Bundy's standards. He had crossed a line from targeting young women to preying on a child. Her body was found weeks later in a pig shed outside Lake City, Florida. It was the last killing of his life, and the one that sealed his fate. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was pulled over by a Pensacola police officer named David Lee. The stolen orange Volkswagen he was driving had been reported, and when Lee approached, Bundy resisted arrest. They struggled, and Lee subdued him at gunpoint. When asked for his name, Bundy tried to lie, then smiled and said quietly, "I guess you got me." Fingerprints confirmed the impossible. The man they had in custody was Theodore Robert Bundy, one of America's most wanted fugitives. His capture marked the end of a years-long manhunt that stretched across multiple states. The facade of the charming law student had crumbled. What remained was a gaunt, exhausted man staring blankly into the camera during his mugshot. The mask finally gone. Investigators quickly connected Bundy to the Chi Omega murders and the abduction of Kimberly Leach. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts, bite mark analysis, fibers, and stolen items linked directly to him. Yet Bundy seemed unfazed. For him, the trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was theater. In 1979, the Chi Omega trial began in Miami, Florida. It was one of the first major cases in U.S. history to be broadcast nationally, and Bundy reveled in the spotlight. Acting as his own attorney, he cross-examined witnesses, debated prosecutors, and smiled for cameras. His charm had not vanished. It had evolved into arrogance. He treated the courtroom as a stage, the audience as his jury in more ways than one. When prosecutors presented the bite mark evidence from Lisa Levy's body, matched precisely to Bundy's teeth, it became the turning point of the trial. The scientific detail and precision left no doubt. Bundy, however, remained composed. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he nodded slowly, almost respectfully. For the Chi Omega murders, he was sentenced to death. But Bundy's courtroom saga wasn't over. A second trial was scheduled in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Once again, Bundy tried to manipulate the system, marrying his former girlfriend Carol Ann Boone in the middle of the proceedings by exploiting a Florida law that recognized declarations of marriage made in court as legal. It was a performance meant to humanize him, to show he was still in control. But the jury was unmoved. He was convicted again and sentenced to death a second time. From 1980 onward, Bundy sat on death row at Florida State Prison, living in a small cell that became both sanctuary and stage. The world outside couldn't get enough of him. Journalists lined up for interviews, criminologists studied his psyche, and authors scrambled to publish his story. Bundy, ever the manipulator, played each one differently. To some, he presented himself as repentant and misunderstood. To others, as defiant and brilliant. He was performing until the end. During these years, he developed an almost cult-like following. Letters poured in from admirers, mostly women, who believed he was innocent or misunderstood. Some were drawn to his intelligence, others to his looks, and some to the morbid allure of danger. It was a phenomenon psychologists later labeled hybristophilia, attraction to those who commit violent crimes. Bundy fed on it, using his charm to maintain a sense of power, even while confined. But behind the theatrics, cracks of reality showed. In private, Bundy was isolated, paranoid, and deeply anxious. He had moments of genuine fear, not of death, but of irrelevance. The man who had once controlled every detail of his life now had nothing left to manipulate but words. In the final years before his execution, Bundy began confessing to his crimes, often in vague or manipulative ways. He would hint at murders without naming victims, teasing investigators with partial truths. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, newly formed at the time, interviewed him extensively to understand the psychology of serial killers. Bundy became a key case study in profiling. His insights, half self-serving, half revealing, helped shape modern criminal psychology. In 1984, while the world was losing interest in his appeals, Bundy's life inside prison took on an eerie routine. He read constantly, law books, religious texts, and true crime stories. He continued to correspond with Carol Ann Boone, who eventually gave birth to a daughter rumored to be his. But even that relationship began to crumble. Boone grew disillusioned with his manipulations and withdrew from his life. As his final appeal dates drew closer, Bundy began to talk, really talk. In 1989, knowing the end was inevitable, he sat down for a series of interviews with religious broadcaster Dr. James Dobson. In those final hours, Bundy claimed that violent pornography had fueled his urges. It was a calculated move, appealing to conservative America's moral fears. But those who studied him saw through it. He was controlling the narrative one last time, framing himself as a cautionary tale rather than a predator. Bundy's confessions before death were chilling. He described some murders in detached, clinical detail. He spoke of returning to crime scenes, revisiting bodies, and reimagining his crimes. It wasn't remorse. It was ownership. Even as he faced execution, Bundy sought to reclaim power through memory. On January 24th, 1989, after a decade of appeals, Ted Bundy was led to Florida State Prison's execution chamber. Outside, hundreds gathered, some with signs reading "Burn, Bundy, burn," others holding candles for his victims. Reporters crowded the gates, cameras flashed, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Inside, Bundy was calm. He looked composed, polite, almost reflective. When asked for his final words, he said softly, "Give my love to my family and friends." Seconds later, 2,000 volts surged through his body. It was over. Outside the prison, a crowd erupted in cheers. For some, it was justice served. For others, a grim satisfaction. But for those who studied Bundy, the moment was sobering. The man who had spent his life mastering control had met an end he could not manipulate. In the aftermath, Bundy's name became synonymous with evil disguised as charm. His case reshaped how law enforcement approached serial crime, forensic evidence, and criminal profiling. The bite mark evidence used in his trial became a landmark in forensic science, and his psychological interviews helped define what would later be called the organized killer archetype. Yet the fascination with Bundy has never truly faded. Decades after his death, books, films, and documentaries continue to revisit his story. Some explore the psychology of his manipulation. Others question the cultural obsession with him. Why do we keep returning to Bundy? Perhaps because he forces us to confront a terrifying truth: that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and remembers your name. Psychologists often describe Bundy as a perfect storm of pathology: narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial behavior, and sexual sadism, all wrapped in intelligence and charm. But those labels, while clinical, fail to capture what made him uniquely horrifying: his ability to blend seamlessly into ordinary life. He was the stranger beside us, the trusted face, the danger hidden in plain sight. Bundy's legacy is a warning that evil is not always an external force, but something that can be constructed quietly, piece by piece, inside a person who learns to fake humanity so well that no one suspects a thing. He represents the thin line between appearance and reality, between normalcy and nightmare. In the end, Ted Bundy was not a monster born, but one made by secrecy, by rejection, by ego, and by his own choices. His life is a chilling testament to how far intelligence and charm can carry darkness when it goes unchecked. And though his story has been told countless times, it still unsettles because it demands an uncomfortable realization. The true danger lies not in the grotesque, but in the familiar. Evil, in Ted Bundy's world, did not hide in the shadows. It looked us straight in the eye and smiled. If this story left you thinking, remember to like, subscribe, and join us next time as we explore more true stories from the shadows, told slowly, calmly, and truthfully.